Good evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this is my friend Gingersnap here. So welcome back to our living room for our Bible study series, loosely on biblical apocrypha. So apocryphal or apocrypha is a great word. Usually it's of dubious origins, the sort of thing that may or may not have happened. So there are a handful of books or stories within books in the Bible that are included in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but not usually in ours. So usually this is because they were written a bit later than maybe the rest of the book, so they were probably written by somebody else. Or also, I guess there kind of just needs to be a cutoff point. And so our Bible doesn't have that much that happened after Jesus, other than Acts of the Apostles and the epistles, obviously. Anyway, so last week we read the story of Susanna and the Elders, which is a story that I genuinely enjoy quite a bit. It was definitely written much after most of the book of Daniel, so I do kind of see, like, academically why it wasn't included, but it's still a fun story that has a good message that might as well be shared, I suppose. So tonight's story is rather along those lines. So last week's story, Susanna and the Elders, is like one of maybe the first, I think, recorded detective story, like in literature, which is pretty fun. So tonight's story is like a closed room murder mystery kind of thing, like very Agatha Christie, which is just rather, it's delightful. It's delightful. So, Belle and the Dragon, because dragon stories are always a fun time. So once upon a time, when I forgot to look up how to pronounce that. When King Astyages was laid to rest with his ancestors, Cyrus the Persian succeeded to his kingdom. Daniel was a companion of the king, and was the most honored of all his friends. I think this is later in Daniel's life. Last week we had like Daniel's origin story, as like Daniel is a very young man. So now the Babylonians had an idol called Bel. And every day they provided for it 12 bushels of choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. It's a lot of food and a lot of wine. The king revered it and went every day to worship it. But Daniel worshipped his own God. So the king said to Daniel, "Why do you not worship Bel?" Daniel answered, "Because I do not revere idols made with hands, but the living God, who created heaven and earth and has dominion over all living creatures." The king said to him, "Do you not think that Bel is a living God? Do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day?" And Daniel laughed and said, "Do not be deceived, O king, for this thing is only clay inside and bronze outside, and it never ate or drank anything." Then the king was angry and called the priests of Bel and said to them, "If you do not tell me who is eating these provisions, you shall die. But if you prove that Bel is eating them, Daniel shall die, because he has spoken blasphemy against Bel." Daniel said to the king, "Let it be done as you have said." So the king is telling the priests to prove that this statue of Bel the dragon is eating all of this food that gets left for him every day. Spoiler alert, the dragon's not eating food because the dragon is not a living god. You probably saw that twist coming. I hope I didn't spoil it for you. Now, there were 70 priests of Bel. That is a lot of priests, besides their wives and children. So the king went with Daniel into the temple of Bel. The priests of Bel said, "See, we are now going outside. You yourself, O king, set out the food and prepare the wine, and shut the door and seal it with your signet. When you return in the morning, if you do not find that Bel has eaten it all, we will die. Otherwise, Daniel will, who is telling lies about us." They were unconcerned, for beneath the table they had made a hidden entrance through which they used to go in regularly and consume the provisions. After they had gone out, the king set out the food for Bel. Then Daniel ordered his servants to bring ashes, and they scattered them throughout the whole temple in the presence of the king alone. Then they went out, shut the door, and sealed it with the king's signet, and departed. During the night, the priests came as usual, with their wives and children, and they ate and drank everything. Early in the morning, the king rose and came, and Daniel with him. The king said, "Are the seals unbroken, Daniel?" Daniel answered, "They are unbroken, O king." As soon as the doors were opened, the king looked at the table and shouted in a loud voice, "You are great, O Bel, and in you there is no deceit at all." But Daniel laughed and restrained the king from going in. "Look at the floor," he said, "and notice whose footprints these are." The king said, "I see the footprints of men and women and children." Then the king was enraged, and he arrested the priests and their wives and children. They showed him the secret doors through which they used to enter to consume what was on the table. Therefore the king put them to death and gave Bel over to Daniel, who destroyed it and its temple. So, the priests had a whole charade going on there. Of course, 70 priests do need to eat somehow or other. And it would be one thing if, the food were left for them, or if they said that, as part of the sacrifice, they ate the food on behalf of the god or whatever. I don't exactly know how pagan sacrifices work for, maybe reasons you could guess. But instead, they lie and say that the dragon statue is eating and drinking all of this food and wine, which, lying is not great. It's maybe not great. So this story about Daniel and a dragon is then immediately followed by another story about Daniel and a dragon that is pretty thematically similar. So it might be that there was a story about Daniel and a dragon that got split off into two different versions. So I'll read this one too. It's also fun. Now in that place there was a great dragon, which the Babylonians revered. The king said to Daniel, "You cannot deny that this is a living God, so worship him." Daniel said, "I worship the Lord my God, who is the living God. But give me permission, O king, and I will kill the dragon without sword or club." The king said, "I give you permission." Then Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair, and boiled them together and made cakes, which he fed to the dragon. Sounds delicious. The dragon ate them and burst open. Then Daniel said, "See what you have been worshiping." Because clearly, if it were a god, it wouldn't have died from a bad snack. When the Babylonians heard about it, they were very indignant and conspired against the king, saying, "The king has become a Jew. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon and slaughtered the priests." Going to the king, they said, "Hand Daniel over to us, or else we will kill you and your household." The king saw that they were pressing him hard, and under compulsion, he handed Daniel over to them. So then Daniel ends up in a lion's den, which is also a story that is elsewhere in Daniel. So it's kind of interesting how this was clearly like a story that was passed down from oral storytelling and had a slightly different version. I won't read the bit about Daniel in the lion's den because it's more likely that you know that story than you know the story of Bel and the dragon. So these stories are kind of maybe amount to fan fiction, which is when there's a published work and people who are not the original author write their own like spin-off stories kind of in the tradition. There used to be kind of that was an accepted form of literature. So you might be writing in the school of some great philosopher, and the way that was described was not in the tradition of so-and-so, but it would just be in that original person's name, which is interesting. And definitely not how academics works today. That would be called plagiarism and dishonest writing, etc. Anyway, but I think this is a neat story, and definitely just in terms of like literature and storytelling and genres, the fact that this is like a 3rd century closed room murder mystery style story is really neat, I think, and definitely speaks to creativity and just anyway. So yeah, so as I was saying, that this story is usually not in our versions of the Bible, but it's still a fun story, and it definitely tells us something about how people believed and how people talked about God, and so it's still worth looking at. So, excuse me, we're saying goodnight to the people. Good night from Gingersnap and me. We are not doing our Wednesday evening prayers anymore for the time being. They might come back at Advent, we shall see. But we are still Zooming on Thursdays at 5 if you would like to join us then. And of course, we hope to see you on Sunday morning at 10 in person, or at about 10:15 for the live stream here on Facebook Live. So good night, peoples, and I hope that you are not eaten by any dragons before I get to see you again.